Hello! Welcome to Quickfire English and this video in which we're going to discuss whether to use which or that when referring to things in relative clauses. Now, this topic confuses a lot of learners and things can get even more complicated because there's a slight difference between American and British English. But stay tuned because we're going to go through it one step at a time, and at the end of the video I'll give you a quick fix that you can use to make sure you never make a mistake. Now, English learners tend to prefer the American practice because it's fairly clear-cut and easy to understand. So we'll start with the US way of doing things, which is use that for restrictive relative clauses and which for non-restrictive relative clauses. Now, if you're anything like my students, right now you're thinking what by Thor's hammer are restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses. So, let's clear that up right now. We'll begin with restrictive relative clauses, and these give necessary information regarding the nouns they modify. So what does that mean? Well, let's illustrate things with an example. If you were to say they work for a company that makes buses, the part of the sentence beginning with that, highlighted here in blue, is the restrictive relative clause, and this contains information which is essential for the principal meaning of the sentence, because if you were to remove the restrictive relative clause, you would no longer communicate the main message of the sentence. In this case, removing the restrictive relative clause would leave us with the sentence, they work for a company. Now, there's no mistake here. The sentence is still grammatically correct, but the principal motivation of the sentence was to highlight a specific piece of information about the company, namely that it makes buses. So if you remove the restrictive relative clause, you also remove the principal meaning of the sentence. And if we want to communicate that principal meaning, we have to put the restrictive relative clause back in. Okay, so restrictive relative clauses contain information which is necessary for the principal meaning of the sentence. Let's now contrast this with non-restrictive relative clauses. And these give information that is not necessary for the principal meaning of the sentence. And let's illustrate this with another example. Say you're planning to go somewhere with your friend. He comes over, you invite him in, and you sit and chat for a while. Then he looks at his watch and says, "Let's go. My car, which cost a lot of money, is parked outside." Now, the main point of that sentence is what? It's that your friend's car is parked outside, because that tells you how you and your friend can get going. The price of the car is irrelevant, and maybe your friend has thrown in that extra non-essential information just because he wants to make himself sound wealthy. So the non-restrictive relative clause, highlighted here in blue, contains non-essential additional information. For that reason, we separate it from the rest of the sentence with commas. And if we remove the non-restrictive relative clause, we get, "Let's go, my car is parked outside." And as you can see, we still have the principal meaning of the sentence. So, now that we've clarified what restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses are, let's just repeat the American practice for when to use that or which in relative clauses, which is use that for restrictive clauses and which for non-restrictive clauses. And as you can see, both of our example sentences follow this pattern. And again, it's a guideline which English learners like to hear because it's fairly straightforward. Unfortunately for you guys though, British English has to come along and spoil everybody's fun by making things a little more complicated. So what's the practice in the UK? Well, in Britain you can use either that or which in restrictive relative clauses. So in our previous sentence we could have said, they work for a company that makes buses, or they work for a company which makes buses. Both are possible and there's no difference in meaning. Now, with non-restrictive relative clauses, the British practice is just the same as the American, namely that you can only use which in non-restrictive relative clauses. Okay then, let's summarise. First of all, restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses. Restrictive relative clauses give necessary information regarding the nouns they modify, and they are not separated from the rest of the sentence by commas. In contrast, non-restrictive relative clauses give information that is not necessary for the principal meaning of the sentence, and they are separated from the rest of the sentence by commas. And finally, let's just go over the American practice versus the British one more time. In US English, use that for restrictive clauses and which for non-restrictive clauses. And in British English, you can use either that or which with restrictive clauses, but you can only use which for non-restrictive relative clauses. Now, I'm just going to add a couple of footnotes here, which might at first appear to confuse things a little. But fear not, that quick fix I promised you is going to come straight afterwards to make your life much easier. So, what are these footnotes? Well, first is that in everyday use, even some Americans use which in restrictive relative clauses, so don't be too surprised if you encounter that. And secondly, just to complicate things even more, even in Britain, some publishing style guides follow the American practice, meaning they require that for restrictive relative clauses and which for non-restrictive clauses. Okay, now that we've added an extra layer of complexity, let's make things easy for you. Here's the quick fix that you can follow to make sure you never make a mistake. With relative clauses, my advice would be just follow the American way of doing things. Use that for restrictive relative clauses and which for non-restrictive relative clauses. That way you'll never make a mistake. But at the same time, just be aware that some native speakers, especially the British ones, may use which in restrictive relative clauses. Now, if my 14 years of teaching tell me nothing else, it's that there's a good chance some of you are now thinking to yourselves, okay dude, you've told us about British and American English, but what on earth is that accent and where by Jon Snow's beard do you come from? So allow me to fess up that I actually speak British English, I just come from north of the wall, as it were. Okay, if there are any questions on the content of this video, let me know in the comments and I'll try to answer them as best I can. And if you got something out of this video, please do me a solid and hit the like button. Please also consider subscribing. Finally, if you have any topics you'd like me to cover in future videos, feel free to suggest them, either in the comments below or by email. Okay, we are out. Cheers for watching and I'll see you in the next video.